The gun was already pressed against Samuel Yates' temple when Theodora Callahan walked through the saloon doors. She stopped dead in the doorway, the late afternoon sun blazing behind her like a halo she had never earned, and she saw everything in a single terrible second. The overturned chairs, the barkeep flat against the back wall with his hands raised, and Victor Crane, all 300 pounds of him, one thick arm wrapped around Samuel's throat from behind, a Colt revolver gleaming against the side of Samuel's head. Theodora. Samuel's voice was impossibly calm for a man whose life balanced on a hair trigger. His green eyes found hers across the wreckage of the saloon floor, and what she saw in them was not fear. It was something worse. It was guilt. "You need to leave." "She stays," Victor said, and he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had planned this moment down to the last detail. "In fact, she's exactly who I've been waiting on." Theodora's hand drifted toward the small derringer she kept tucked in the waistband beneath her apron, but Victor clicked the hammer back, and the sound rang through the saloon like a church bell striking midnight. "I wouldn't," he said softly. "Not unless you want to see what the inside of Samuel Yates' skull looks like." The whole town of Cutters Creek, New Mexico Territory, had warned her. Every last soul from the telegraph operator to the preacher's wife had told her that getting close to Samuel Yates meant getting close to the storm that followed him. She had not listened. She had been so certain she was smarter than the warnings, stronger than the pull of whatever dark past clung to that quiet, careful man like smoke to wool. She had been wrong. And now she had 40 feet of saloon floor between her and the man she had fallen in love with, and a killer holding the balance of his life in one thick finger. "What do you want, Victor?" she asked, keeping her voice even the way her father had taught her before the consumption took him and left her to fend for herself. "What I want," Victor said pleasantly, "is the deed to your property on Redstone Ridge, the one your daddy left you, the one you've been refusing to sell for 8 months. He pressed the barrel harder against Samuel's temple. "I thought maybe a little persuasion was in order." Theodora looked at Samuel. Samuel looked back at her, and she could see the precise moment he decided to do something that was going to get him killed, and she made up her mind in the same instant. "All right," she said. "I'll sign it over." "Theodora, no," Samuel said sharply. "Quiet, Samuel," she looked at Victor. "But you let him go first." Victor laughed. "That's not how persuasion works, sweetheart." It had been 4 months since Theodora Callahan arrived in Cutters Creek, and she had not intended to stay more than a week. She had come down from Santa Fe in the spring of 1878, riding in the back of a freight wagon with a trunk full of her father's surveying instruments and a letter from a lawyer she had never met. Patrick Callahan had died in January, and he had left his only daughter a parcel of land he had staked on Redstone Ridge 6 years prior, a piece of high country earth that overlooked the valley floor like a cathedral, overlooking its congregation. The lawyer's letter said the land had value. It did not say what kind. Theodora was 24 years old, and she had spent the previous 3 years keeping house for a schoolmaster in Santa Fe while studying his library whenever he was out. She was educated in the particular way that women who are refused formal schooling become educated, which is to say she was more capable than most men around her, and considerably less likely to be taken seriously for it. She was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of serious gray eyes that made people instinctively lower their voices when she looked directly at them. She had a reputation for directness that made certain men uncomfortable, and a stubbornness that had gotten her into more trouble than she cared to count. She arrived in Cutters Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, when the desert was just beginning to remember that summer was coming, and the red earth glowed like something caught between fire and stone. She climbed down from the freight wagon with her trunk and her letter and looked up the main street of the town, and Cutters Creek looked back at her with the particular wariness of a place that has learned to be suspicious of strangers. The town itself was not much to speak of in 1878. There was a main street with a general store, a livery, a bank, a land office, a barber shop, and the Rattlesnake Saloon. There was a modest church at the north end of town and a doctor's office that doubled as the dentist's whenever Dr. Forsyth could be persuaded to pull a tooth. About 300 people called Cutter's Creek home, spread between the town itself and the ranches and homesteads that dotted the surrounding land, and every single one of them seemed to know, within 20 minutes of Theodora's arrival, that Patrick Callahan's daughter had come to claim his land on Redstone Ridge. The lawyer's name was Arthur Gibbs, and he was a narrow, nervous man who met her at the door of his office on the second floor of the general store building, with the distinct air of a person who has been dreading a particular conversation for several months. "Miss Callahan," he said, shaking her hand with damp fingers, "please come in. There are some things about your father's estate that you should know before you make any decisions about the property." The things she should know were these. Redstone Ridge sat directly above a seam of silver ore that geologists had identified 3 years prior. The ore was deep but rich, and accessing it required the high ground that Patrick Callahan had staked. Victor Crane, who owned the largest mining operation in the territory and kept a permanent presence in Cutter's Creek through his hired men and his investment in the local bank, had been attempting to acquire the Callahan land since Patrick's death. He had offered fair prices, then unfair prices, then prices so large they had made Arthur Gibbs's hands tremble when he wrote them down in his letters. Patrick Callahan, who had not known about the silver when he staked the land but had learned about it quickly enough afterward, had refused every offer. He had also died before he could do anything useful with the information. Theodora sat across from Arthur Gibbs and listened to all of this with the careful attention of a woman who understands that the details matter, and when he finished, she folded her hands in her lap and said, "Who else in this town does Victor Crane not own?" Gibbs looked at her for a long moment. "Not many," he admitted. "The Hendersons at the general store keep their own counsel. Dr. Forsyth, the preacher." He hesitated. "Samuel Yates." "Who is Samuel Yates?" "He runs the livery stable." Gibbs seemed to weigh his next words. "He was a U.S. Marshal for 7 years. He came here 2 years ago and hasn't said much about why he stopped." He paused again. "Victor Crane would very much like to have him gone from Cutter's Creek, which tells you something." Theodora filed the name away and went to find a room at the boarding house. She met Samuel Yates the following morning, when she went to the livery to rent a horse to ride out and see her father's land. He was at the far end of the stable when she came in, working on a bay mare's left rear shoe with the focused quiet of a man entirely at home in physical labor. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who have spent years outdoors become weathered, with dark hair that had grown slightly too long and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He was not a particularly large man, but there was something in the way he moved, something precise and unhurried and absolutely conscious of the space around him, that made the stable feel smaller than it was. He looked up when she came in, and she got the full force of those green eyes, which were startling in a face so darkened by sun and wind. And then he straightened and wiped his hands on his work trousers and waited for her to speak. "I need to rent a horse for the day," she said. "I'm riding out to Redstone Ridge." Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "You're Patrick Callahan's daughter," he said. "Theodora Callahan." "Yes." He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded and went to the far stall and brought out a gray gelding with an easy temperament and a smooth gait. He saddled the horse himself, which was not strictly necessary since Theodora was perfectly capable of saddling her own horse, but she did not object. "You know anything about the ridge?" he asked, tightening the cinch. "I know there's silver under it and that Victor Crane wants it badly enough to have made my father's last years complicated." Samuel handed her the reins. "It's also good land on its own. Patrick knew what he was doing when he staked it. High ground, good water, southwest exposure. You could build something up there worth having, separate from the silver entirely." He paused, and she had the feeling this was more words than he usually offered a stranger. if you're planning to stay." "I haven't decided," she said. She rode out to Redstone Ridge and stood on the high ground above the valley and looked out at the landscape that her father had chosen, the wide red expanse of it, the mountains cutting blue silhouettes against the sky to the north, the valley floor green and silver with sage, and the thin glitter of a creek winding through it far below. The land was real in a way that was difficult to describe. It felt like it had been waiting for her. She went back to town and extended her room at the boarding house for a month. She also went back to the livery, not to return the horse since she had already done that, but because she had questions. Samuel Yates answered them with the direct economy of a man who had long since given up on speaking more than was necessary, and she found to her own surprise that she respected that considerably more than the elaborate courtesy she received from most men. "You were a marshal," she said, not as a question. He was cleaning a bridle, working the leather with oil and a soft cloth. He did not look up. 7 years. Why did you stop? A pause, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then there was a situation. A man I was supposed to bring in. His hands kept moving on the leather. I made a choice that saved his life and cost 2 other people theirs. I was cleared by the service, technically, but I don't carry a badge anymore. He said it the way you say a thing that you have said so many times in your own head that it has become smooth and factual, all the ragged edges worn off, and somehow that smoothness was more telling than any display of emotion would have been. "Do you miss it?" she asked. He did look up then. "I miss being useful," he said. She went back to the boarding house and lay awake thinking about that answer for longer than was sensible. Over the following weeks, she found reasons to be at the livery. Some of them were genuine. She needed to learn the land, and that required a horse, and Samuel had the best stock in town and charged fair prices, and never once spoke to her, as though she were incapable of understanding what he was telling her. Some of the reasons were less genuine, but she was honest enough with herself to recognize them for what they were, even if she was not yet ready to do anything about them. Victor Crane made his first personal appearance in late May, coming into town from his mine operation in a private coach, with 2 armed men riding beside it. He was a big, broad-shouldered man in his middle 40s with a silver-streaked beard and the practiced pleasantness of someone who has spent a great many years getting what he wants through the combination of money and charm, and when that fails, through other means. He found Theodora at the general store and introduced himself with an outstretched hand and a smile that showed all his teeth. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I hope you've settled in comfortably. I knew your father, you know. A fine man." A stubborn man, God rest him, but fine. Theodora shook his hand because she was not yet ready to show her cards. "Mr. Crane, I hope Arthur Gibbs has been helpful in explaining the situation with your father's land. I would hate for you to be under any misapprehension about the options available to you." He smiled again. "I'd like to make you a very fair offer for Redstone Ridge, Miss Callahan. Very fair indeed." "I'll think about it," she said pleasantly, and bought her flour and her soap and left. She told Samuel about it that evening. She had developed the habit of stopping by the livery near closing time, officially to check on the gray gelding she had taken to renting by the week, and they would stand in the cool of the stable as the evening came down over the desert and talk, really talk, in the way she had not talked with anyone since her father was well enough to hold a conversation. She had not fully understood how isolated her last 3 years in Santa Fe had been until she found this thing. This easy back and forth with a man who listened like listening was something he took seriously. "What did you say?" Samuel asked. "I told him I'd think about it." "That's the right answer for now." He was quiet for a moment. "Crane doesn't lose gracefully. You should know that before you tell him no." "I assumed," she said. "What do I have to know about the legal situation? Can he take it from me through the courts?" "Not while the deed is clean and registered." He looked at her carefully. "Keep your deed somewhere safe, not at the land office, somewhere personal." She had it under the floorboard of her room at the boarding house by the time she went asleep that night. June came and July. Theodora began spending more time at the Rattlesnake Saloon, which was not the occupation most respectable women chose, but the saloon's owner, a practical woman named Clara Dix who had built the establishment herself and ran it with considerable shrewdness, offered her work keeping the books and managing accounts, and Theodora took it. It gave her an income, a purpose, and a window into everything that moved through Cutter's Creek, which turned out to be more useful than she had anticipated. What moved through Cutter's Creek included Victor Crane's money. It flowed through the bank, through the saloon, through the pockets of half a dozen men who answered to Crane in ways both official and unofficial. The sheriff, a thin man named Walt Dukes, had the particular carefully maintained neutrality of a person who has been paid to look in the other direction. The deputy was less carefully maintained and simply obvious about his loyalties. Samuel knew all of this. She knew he knew it, and he knew she knew it, and there was something in the shared knowledge that pulled them closer together in a way that was about more than just the practical situation. It was on a Thursday evening in late July when things shifted between them, in the particular way that things shift between people who have been circling a truth for long enough. She had stayed later than usual at the saloon, working through a column of figures that kept refusing to balance, and Samuel had come in not for a drink, but because he had seen her lamp still burning through the window and had apparently decided this required investigation. Clara had already gone upstairs. The two of them sat at the corner table with the account book spread between them, and Samuel, who turned out to have a surprising facility with numbers, had found her error in under 3 minutes. "There," he said, pointing. "You've carried the 4 twice." She leaned over to look, and they were close enough that she could smell the clean, particular scent of him, soap and leather and the dry summer air, and when she looked up to confirm she understood his correction. His face was very near hers and they were both completely still for a moment that lasted slightly too long to be accounted for by the arithmetic. She said, "Thank you," and her voice came out lower than she intended. He said, "Of course," and did not move away. Then he did move away, sitting back in his chair and picking up his coffee cup with the deliberate care of a man reestablishing a boundary, and she felt both relieved and genuinely bereft, which told her everything she needed to know about what was happening inside her. She went back to the boarding house and lay awake for a long time thinking about the distance between sensible decisions and true ones. The summer deepened, and the situation with Victor Crane deepened alongside it. He sent Arthur Gibbs to her twice more with revised offers, each one larger than the last. She declined politely and kept her deed under the floorboard and her derringer loaded. She was not afraid precisely, but she was not naive either, and she noticed the way Crane's men watched her when she moved through town, the particular unhurried attention of people tracking something they intend to collect. She told Samuel about the new offers and he listened, and then he said, "He'll stop using money soon." "What comes after money?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. "Pressure," Samuel said. "Of various kinds." He was right. In August, someone went through her room at the boarding house while she was at the saloon. Nothing was taken, which meant it was a message, not a theft. The deed was still under the floorboard, undisturbed, because she had already moved it to a more secure location she kept to herself. She reported the intrusion to Sheriff Dukes, who wrote something down in a notebook and did nothing else. She did not tell Samuel about the intrusion for 2 days, and when she finally did, he was quiet for a long moment that had a different quality than his usual quiet. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, and then, because she had been completely honest with this man about everything else and did not want to stop, "No, it frightened me. Not because they found anything, but because it meant they'll keep trying." He nodded. "I want you to let me walk you back to the boarding house at night," he said. "I know you don't need someone to protect you. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I would feel better knowing you arrived safely, and I think you might as well." She looked at him. "All right," she said. He began walking her home at night. It was a distance of perhaps 6 blocks through the main street of Cutter's Creek, and it took them rarely less than 45 minutes because they were always talking, or because they were not talking at all but walking in the particular comfortable silence of people who have stopped needing to fill the space between them with noise. He would stop at her door and she would say good night, and he would wait until he heard the bolt slide home before he turned and walked back up the street. It was on one of these walks in mid-August, under a sky so thick with stars that the darkness between them seemed almost incidental, that she asked him about the choice he had made, the one that had ended his career as a marshal. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had overstepped, and she was about to say so when he spoke. "There was a man named Cord Jessup," he said. "He'd killed 3 people, 2 of them in cold blood, one in a fire he set to cover his tracks. I tracked him for 11 months across 3 territories. When I finally caught him, I had him in cuffs and we were 3 days from the nearest town with a proper jail." He paused. "On the second night, one of the 2 men riding with me, a deputy named Elliot, tried to kill Jessup in his sleep, not for justice, for the bounty, which was substantial, and because taking a prisoner back alive takes longer and requires more explaining." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "I stopped Elliot," he said. "I should have handled it quietly and moved on. Instead, I arrested him for attempted murder on a federal prisoner, which created a situation on the trail. Jessup got loose in the confusion. He killed Elliot, which was perhaps justice of a kind, and he killed the other deputy, who was a good man named Chester Farrow, who had a wife and 3 children in Albuquerque." He started walking again. "By the time I caught Jessup again and brought him in, the service had decided the whole thing was too messy. They cleared me technically and let me go quietly." She walked beside him in silence for a moment. Then she said, "You did the right thing. Chester Farrow is still dead." "Yes," she said. "That's the kind of thing that doesn't get better by making the wrong choice feel like the right one in retrospect. You couldn't have let Elliot murder a man in custody, even a guilty one. The fault for what happened to Chester is Jessup's and Elliot's, not yours." He looked at her sidelong. "You arrive at conclusions quickly," he said. "I've had a lot of practice thinking through things that are hard," she said. They walked the rest of the way to her door in quiet, and when she said good night, he held her gaze for a moment and said, "Thank you, Theodora," and the way he said her name made something in her chest pull like a string being drawn taut. She did not sleep for a long time. In September, Victor Crane came back to town with more men. There were 6 of them now in his regular retinue, hard-faced and well-armed, and they made a visible presence in Cutter's Creek that served its purpose, which was to remind people that Victor Crane's displeasure had physical dimensions. He came to find Theodora at the saloon on a Wednesday afternoon when Clara was out and 2 of Crane's men were the only other people present. "I'm losing my patience," he said pleasantly, sitting down across from her without being invited. "I've made you more than fair offers, more than fair. Your father was a reasonable man ultimately. I expect you'll be reasonable as well." "My father refused your offers for 6 years, Theodora said, not looking up from the ledger she was working in. "Your father made his choices and they led to certain consequences." He said it without inflection, and the phrase sat on the table between them with the specific weight of a threat that can always be denied. She looked up at him then. She kept her face neutral with the effort of practice. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Crane?" "I'm discussing reality with you, Miss Callahan." He smiled. "The reality is that this territory can be an uncomfortable place for a woman alone without the right kind of friends. I could be the right kind of friend." "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He left and she sat for a moment in the silence of the empty saloon and let herself feel the cold certainty of what was coming. Then she closed the ledger and went to find Samuel. She found him at the livery, where he was to be found most days. She told him what Crane had said, and he listened, and when she was done, he set down the tool he had been holding with a precision that suggested effort. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "Victor Crane is the reason I left the Marshal service," he said. "Not directly. Cord Jessup was working for Crane, running stolen silver out of mine operations in Colorado. When the service cleared me and let me go, part of the arrangement was that the investigation into Crane's operations would be handled differently." He met her eyes. "Meaning it wouldn't be handled at all?" Crane had connections at a level that made direct federal action complicated. She sat down on a hay bale. "You came here because of him," she said. "You came here to watch him." "I came here because I left the service with nothing resolved and I couldn't stop." He sat down across from her, his forearms on his knees, and he looked genuinely tired in a way she had not seen before. "I didn't expect your father to be dead when I got here. I didn't expect you. What did you expect to do?" She asked. "Without a badge, build evidence. Wait for the right moment. Find a federal judge willing to act on what Crane was actually doing." He paused. "I have the evidence, 8 months of it. What I've been waiting on is the right lever." "And I'm the lever," she said. "No," his voice was sharp. "That is not what I mean. What I mean is that the situation changed when you arrived, and I should have told you earlier what I knew, and I didn't because I didn't want to put you in more danger than you were already in." He looked at her steadily. "I was wrong not to tell you. I'm telling you now." She thought about this. She thought about the 8 months of evidence, and the federal judge, and the way Crane had said your father made his choices, and the way Samuel had said I didn't expect you. "Show me the evidence," she said. He had it in a lockbox under the floorboards of the livery's back room, which she found bleakly amusing given her own security arrangements. He spread it on the workbench. Affidavits from mine workers who had left Crane's operation and were willing to testify, records of the stolen silver shipments, letters between Crane and a territorial judge who had been paid to dismiss claims against him, and 3 separate accounts placing Crane's men at the scene of a fire that had killed a homesteader family named Ortega who had refused to sell their water rights 18 months ago. She read through everything methodically. Samuel stood beside her and answered questions when she had them. When she was done, she straightened and said, "Who is the federal judge you've been waiting on?" "Judge Amos Whitfield out of Santa Fe. He's been building a case against Crane's political connections for 2 years. He's waiting on physical evidence from the territory. Can we get this to him? I've been waiting until I had enough to make it impossible to suppress." He looked at her. "I think we have enough." "Then we send it," she said, "tomorrow, before Crane moves from threats to actions." He nodded. "There's a risk in that. Once the letter is sent, once Crane learns there's a federal investigation in motion, he'll know someone here provided it, and he'll act before a judge can intervene. How long would it take Whitfield to respond? 2 weeks at minimum, perhaps 3. She looked at Samuel. "Then we have 2 to 3 weeks to keep Crane convinced that nothing has changed. That's asking you to pretend every day that you're still considering his offer." "I'm capable of pretending," she said. "Are you?" He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that she had come to watch for, the slight shift in the muscles around his eyes that was as close as he usually came. "I've been pretending for 8 months," he said. They sent the letter the following morning, wrapped in an ordinary freight manifest, handed to a writer Theodora trusted who was heading to Santa Fe anyway. They told no one else. Clara Dix had her own survival instincts and her own relationship with the careful balance of power in Cutter's Creek, and Theodora liked her too much to put her in the path of what was coming. The 2 weeks that followed were a particular kind of sustained performance. Theodora was civil to Crane's men and vague about her intentions with the land. She kept her books at the saloon and walked home with Samuel at night, and they talked about everything and nothing, about the surveying instruments her father had left her, and the mathematics of celestial navigation, about the question of whether the transcontinental railroad would change the territory or simply change which men got rich from it, about Samuel's years tracking men across landscapes so wide they made personal problems seem almost funny in their smallness. What they did not talk about, not directly, was the thing between them that had been building since July, the thing that was present in every near silence and every moment of unnecessary closeness, and every time she caught him watching her with an expression that he would iron out the moment he noticed her noticing. It was 10 days into the waiting period, On a night when the temperature had finally broken and the desert air had the particular crystalline quality it gets in early autumn, when she stopped on the dark street between the saloon and the boarding house and said, "Samuel." He stopped beside her. "What is it?" "Nothing is wrong," she said carefully. "I just want to ask you something, and I think I've been not asking it for a while now." He was very still. "Do you feel this?" she asked. It was more direct than she had planned, but she was tired of being indirect about things that mattered. He was quiet for a moment that was only slightly too long. "Yes," he said, "I do. And you haven't said anything because you came here with your father's land and Victor Crane's threat and a future you haven't had the chance to build yet," he said. "And I didn't want you to feel that I had put you in a position, given that you rely on me for—" "I don't rely on you," she said, not unkindly. "I trust you. Those are different things." He looked at her for a long moment. The stars were extraordinary above them, and the town was quiet, and there was nothing between them but a few feet of dark air and whatever decision he was going to make. "I know," he said, "and I trust you. Completely." He moved the few steps that closed the distance and took her face in both his careful hands and kissed her slowly, with the particular gravity of a man who does not do things halfway. She kissed him back. It was, she thought, exactly what a true thing felt like. They stood there on the empty street for a long time, and when they finally separated, he kept his hands on her face for a moment and looked at her with those startling green eyes and said, "I should have said something 8 weeks ago." "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." He laughed then, a real laugh, and she realized she had not heard him laugh like that before, and she filed it away as one of the most valuable things she had yet collected in Cutter's Creek. He walked her to her door and she went inside, and she did not need to think about him to fall asleep that night because she was too perfectly, dangerously happy, which was its own kind of dangerous given the timing. The letter came back in 12 days, not 14. It came to the land office, which was unexpected, because federal communications sometimes went to land offices in territorial towns, and the clerk, who owed nothing to Victor Crane, sent it directly to Theodora. It was from Judge Whitfield's office, and it said that a federal marshal and 2 deputies were already en route to Cutter's Creek with a warrant for Victor Crane and 3 of his associates, expected to arrive within 4 days. She brought the letter to Samuel at the livery, and he read it twice and then folded it and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "4 days," she said. "4 days," he confirmed. "If Crane doesn't learn about this before they arrive, it's over. And if he does learn about it, then he has to decide whether to run or to act." Samuel's voice was even. "He's not the kind of man who runs." She thought about this. "We keep to the plan. 4 more days." 4 more days, he said. They managed 3. On the 3rd day, the freight rider she had trusted with the original letter came back through town, a day earlier than expected, and he stopped at the Rattlesnake for a drink, and he mentioned to the man sitting next to him that he'd delivered an interesting piece of correspondence to Santa Fe a couple weeks back. The man sitting next to him was named Dowd, and Dowd worked for Victor Crane. By evening, Crane knew. By the following morning, Crane had sent 2 men to watch the roads into town, and he himself had come down from the Ridge Road where his men had been camping, and he had walked into the Rattlesnake Saloon with a gun and a purpose, which was where the story began. Theodora stood in the saloon doorway with the late afternoon sun at her back and the Colt pressed against Samuel's temple, and she thought with remarkable clarity for a woman in her situation about the precise geometry of the space between them. She had the derringer at her waistband, 40 feet of floor space. Victor Crane's arm around Samuel's throat, Crane's body mostly behind Samuel's, a poor angle for any shot that didn't risk hitting Samuel himself. The barkeep, a solid man named Pete, flat against the back wall with his hands raised and his eyes watching her with the particular attention of a man waiting for a signal. "The deed," Crane said pleasantly. "Write out a transfer of title and sign it, and I let your Marshal friend here walk out on his own feet." "He's not a Marshal anymore," Theodora said, and she took one step into the saloon and let the door close behind her. "Theodora." Samuel's voice carried a warning she chose to hear and set aside. "I heard you the first time," she told him, and then she looked at Crane. "Here is the problem with what you're proposing, Mr. Crane. A title transfer made under duress is not legally binding. You know that. Your lawyers certainly know that." Crane's pleasantness did not waver. "I'll take my chances." "You'll also be taking your chances with 3 federal marshals who are due to arrive in this town before sundown tomorrow," she said. Something moved in Crane's expression. Not much, but something. She had his attention in a different way now. "Judge Whitfield sends his regards," she said. "He's been building your case for 2 years. We gave him what he needed to execute warrants." She was watching his face and his gun hand simultaneously, and she saw his grip shift, just slightly, and in the same instant she saw Pete the barkeep begin to move. What happened next happened quickly, in the way that things you have dreaded for weeks happen quickly when they finally arrive. Pete came off the wall and grabbed the whiskey bottle he had been inching toward and brought it down hard on the end of the bar, which made a sound like a gunshot, and Crane flinched, which was not much of a flinch, but it was enough, and Samuel dropped his chin and drove his elbow back hard into Crane's solar plexus, and then twisted out of the arm lock with the fluid efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, and the Colt went off. The shot hit the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down. Samuel had Crane's gun hand in both of his own, and then he had the gun. And then he had Victor Crane face down on the floorboards of the Rattlesnake Saloon with a knee in his back. And the whole thing from the moment Pete grabbed the bottle to the moment Crane hit the floor was perhaps 4 seconds. Theodora stood very still in the middle of the saloon floor with the derringer in her hand that she had drawn the moment Pete moved, and she looked at Samuel on top of Crane on the floor, and she let out a breath that felt like it had been compressed inside her for weeks. "Are you hurt?" she said. Samuel looked up at her from Crane's back. There was a cut on his cheekbone from where someone had hit him earlier before she arrived, and his shirt was torn at the collar, and he had plastered dust in his hair from the ceiling shot. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was entirely steady. "Good," she said. "Are you?" "Yes." Pete was already calling for Sheriff Dukes, who arrived in 12 minutes and stood in the saloon doorway looking at Victor Crane on the floor and the derringer in Theodora's hand, and Samuel Yates' expression, and made a series of calculations that arrived at the conclusion that his relationship with Victor Crane was now an historical artifact. "I'll need to hold Mr. Crane until the federal marshals arrive," Samuel said, looking at Dukes with the particular authority of a man who may not carry a badge but has not forgotten how to wear one. Dukes nodded without arguing. They put Crane in the jail that night, and 2 of his men came to the jail an hour later and found both Samuel and Pete standing outside it, and they looked at the situation and rode out of town and did not come back. The federal marshals arrived the following afternoon, just before 4 o'clock, when the desert light was going gold and long. There were 3 of them, led by a marshal named James Hooper, who had the no-nonsense bearing of a man who has made long rides to collect large problems. He read the warrant, reviewed Samuel's evidence, spoke at some length with Theodora about what had happened in the saloon and the 8 months of Crane's campaign against her, and took Victor Crane into federal custody before supper. He also sat down with Samuel privately for nearly an hour, and when Samuel came out of that meeting, his face had the careful blankness of someone processing something significant. She found him at the livery that evening, which was where she always found him. "What did Hooper say?" she asked. Samuel was quiet for a moment. "He said Judge Whitfield asked him to tell me that the service would consider reinstating my credentials if I wanted to come back." He paused. "There's been a review. Apparently Elliot had a history they didn't disclose at the time. The situation with Chester Farrow has been reclassified." She sat down on the hay bale. "What do you want to do?" He sat down across from her, same position as always, and he looked at her with those green eyes that had been startling the first time she saw them, and had not stopped being startling in the 4 months since. "That depends on a few things," he said. Such as? "Such as what you're planning to do with Redstone Ridge now that Victor Crane is in federal custody and the silver seam under it is properly yours." She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since the morning she stood on the high ground and looked out at the valley and felt the land waiting. "I'm going to develop it," she said. "Not the silver, not immediately. The land itself first. My father's surveying instruments are good ones. I can survey the whole parcel properly, plan it out. Eventually, if the silver can be extracted without destroying the land above it, that's a decision for later, and it'll be made properly, with a legitimate operation." She looked at him. "I'm staying." He nodded slowly as though this confirmed something he had already known. "Then I'm staying," he said, he paused, "if that's what you want." She got up from the hay bale and crossed the short space to him and sat down beside him instead, close enough that their shoulders touched, and he turned to look at her at close range. "Yes," she said, "that is what I want." He kissed her again, in the lamplit quiet of the livery, and this time it was different from the first time on the street, less tentative and more certain, the kiss of two people who have moved from the question to the answer. Outside, the desert evening was coming down soft and cool over Cutter's Creek, and somewhere up on Redstone Ridge, the land waited with patient, inherited quiet. The autumn moved forward. Samuel told Marshal Hooper that he would not be returning to the service, which was not a decision he made lightly, and which he explained to Theodora with the same directness she had come to rely on from him. He had built a life in Cutter's Creek. He had reasons to stay that had nothing to do with Victor Crane, and everything to do with what the place had become for him in the past 2 years, reasons that had grown considerably more specific in the past 4 months. And there was also the matter of the livery, which he had built from nothing, and which he was not particularly interested in walking away from. "Also," he said, looking at her across Clara's corner table at the rattlesnake, "I would like to ask you something, and I want to do it properly, not in the middle of a crisis, which seems to be the only mode we've operated in until now." She put her coffee cup down. "All right." He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized this as the particular quiet of someone choosing their words with care. "I know we have not known each other long," he said. 4 months. I know that by any reasonable measure, that's not enough time. I know you came here to build something, your own something, and that's as it should be, and I wouldn't want it otherwise." He met her eyes steadily. "But I also know that I have not felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I am not particularly interested in waiting a conventional amount of time to say so." He reached into his coat pocket and placed on the table between them a ring, simple and plain, a thin band of silver with a small turquoise stone that caught the afternoon light. "I bought this from the silversmith in Santa Fe 3 weeks ago," he said, "before the federal marshals arrived, before I knew how any of it would turn out." He paused. "I was that certain." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about her father's land and the months of walking home through the dark, and the way he had said, "I didn't expect you," with something in his voice she had been carrying around like a found thing. "Yes," she said. He smiled, the full version, not the almost smile. She had not seen it more than twice before. It changed his face completely, made it open and warm and younger than his years, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had been falling in love with him since the moment he handed her the reins of the gray gelding, and said you could build something up there worth having, as though he had already understood something about her nature before she had finished explaining herself. She picked up the ring and put it on her own finger, which made him laugh, and then she took his hand across the table, and Clara Dix, who had witnessed the whole thing from behind the bar with the judicious quiet of a woman who knows the difference between an audience and an intrusion, produced 2 glasses and a bottle of the good whiskey, and set them on the table without comment. They were married in the Cutter's Creek Church on a Saturday morning in November 1878. A month after Victor Crane was transported to Santa Fe under federal escort. The minister was a gentle, wind-burned man named Reverend Cole, who had known Patrick Callahan and who clasped Theodora's hands after the ceremony and told her that her father would have approved, and she believed him. Clara Dick stood up with her, as Witness and Pete the barkeep stood with Samuel, and the whole congregation of Cutter's Creek came, or almost all of it, and the ones who had connections to Crane that they were not yet certain how to explain were also present, because the shape of the town had shifted and they were trying to find their place in the new arrangement. It was, by every account, a beautiful ceremony. The desert November light came through the church windows in long gold columns, and the temperature was mild enough that the doors could be left open, and when they walked out into the street afterward, the town felt like it had made a decision about itself, some collective exhale of the held breath of the past year. They moved into the house Samuel had built on the edge of the livery property, a solid adobe structure with 2 rooms and a covered porch that faced west. It was not large. It was enough. Theodora brought her father's surveying instruments and her books and her trunk, and they reorganized the space with the slightly formal care of 2 people who have been intensely themselves for a long time and are learning to share the particular physics of domestic life. It was easier than either of them had expected, which they both found amusing in their private moments, given that they were both people who had operated independently for years and had strong opinions about most things. But it turned out that the thing that made them good together in crisis, the matching directness, the willingness to say hard things clearly, the habit of trusting each other's judgment, made them good together in quiet too. Winter came to Cutter's Creek in December, not hard the way it came in some places, but real, with cold nights and occasional snow that turned the red earth pale and made the desert look like a different country. Theodora began surveying the Redstone Ridge property properly, riding up in the clear cold mornings with her father's transit and her field notebooks, measuring and recording, building the detailed picture of the land that she would need to make any serious decision about its future. Samuel came with her on the weekends, learning the instruments with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, and they spent those hours on the high ground working side by side and talking, and occasionally not talking, and the land opened itself up to both of them in the way that land does when you spend enough time looking at it with genuine attention. In the evenings, they sat by the stove and she read, and he worked on various things with his hands, harness repair or small woodworking, and sometimes they talked about the future, about what the ridge could become, about whether the silver could eventually be developed in a way that was honest and fair to the workers who would do the work, about what other changes were coming to the territory as the decade turned. In late January, she told him she was expecting a child. He was at the workbench when she told him, and he put down what he was doing and turned to look at her with an expression she could not entirely name, something between astonishment and a depth of feeling that was almost too large to contain in his usual contained expression. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. He crossed the room and took both her hands and held them for a moment, looking at her with those green eyes that she had known by then for 9 months and would know, she was entirely certain, for the rest of her life. "I am," he said slowly, "the luckiest man in the New Mexico territory," she laughed. "That's a low bar given some of the competition." He did not laugh. He was still looking at her with that unguarded expression. "No," he said, "I mean it exactly." She brought his hands up to her face and held them there for a moment, the way he had held her face on the dark street in October, and then she said, "I know you do." Spring came back to the desert in the way it always comes, without ceremony, one morning simply warmer than the one before, the red earth releasing some held winter tension, and the sage brightening and the creek in the valley below the ridge running faster with the snowmelt from the northern mountains. Victor Crane's trial in Santa Fe proceeded through the winter and concluded in March of 1879, when he was convicted on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and being accessory to the deaths of the Ortega family, and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The territorial judge who had taken his money was removed from the bench. Sheriff Dukes resigned in April, and the town elected, after some negotiation, a replacement who had no prior obligation to anyone who wasn't the town itself. The new sheriff was a woman named Ruth Vargas who had grown up in Cutter's Creek and had been quietly furious about the Crane situation for years, and who ran the jail with considerably more integrity than her predecessor. Samuel worked with her in an informal capacity for several months, helping to establish better procedures, drawing on his years with the Marshal service in ways that felt, he told Theodora, like something being finally put to the use it was made for. Their son was born in August of 1879, on a Sunday morning when the summer heat was beginning to break, and the desert smelled of rain that had fallen overnight. Dr. Forsyth was present, and Clara Dix, who had appointed herself an unofficial aunt figure and had opinions about everything including childbirth. Samuel was in the next room for most of it, which was the convention of the time, but the moment Dr. Forsyth opened the door and nodded, he was through it in 2 steps, and beside her with an urgency that Forsyth, who had seen many deliveries, described afterward as the most undisguised expression of relief he had witnessed in 20 years of medicine. They named him Patrick for her father, and gave him his father's middle name, which was James, so he was Patrick James Yates, and he came into the world with a full head of dark hair and his father's eyes, which Theodora pointed out with considerable satisfaction was going to make him a devastating figure when he was older. Samuel held his son in the circle of his arms and looked at him with the particular look of a man encountering something that has permanently reorganized the architecture of his internal world. "He's extraordinary," he said. "He's very new," Theodora said, exhausted and happy and luminous with it. Even so, he looked up at her over the baby's head. "You're extraordinary." She laughed softly. "You say that now. I'll say it in 10 years, he said. "I'll say it in 30. She believed him. The years moved forward. Cutter's Creek grew as the territorial towns grew through the 1880s, the railroad coming through 40 miles to the south in 1882 and changing the character of commerce in a radius of several days' travel. The livery did well, then better, as the increased traffic brought new business, and Samuel expanded it twice and took on 2 assistants, a pair of brothers named Rays who had come up from Sonora, and who proved to be as talented with horses as Samuel himself. Theodora finished her survey of Redstone Ridge in 1881 and filed it properly with the Federal Land Office. And the following year, she entered an agreement with a mining engineer named Harrison Webb, who had a reputation for honest dealing, to develop the silver seam in a way that maintained the structural integrity of the surface land and provided fair wages and conditions for the men who worked it. It was not the fastest or the most profitable way to do it. It was the right way, which she had decided was the only kind she was interested in. The mine was operational by 1883 and profitable by 1884, and the profits went into 3 things: a proper school for Cutter's Creek, which had been operating out of the back of the church since the town's founding, a new building for Dr. Forsyth's practice, and the development of the ridge land itself into a proper working property, the thing her father had always said it could be. They built a house on the ridge in 1884. It was a real house, adobe and timber, with 4 bedrooms and a proper kitchen, and the west-facing porch that Theodora had always intended, looking out over the valley that changed with every season and every hour of the day and never once failed to be beautiful. They moved up from the adobe by the livery in the spring, and the first evening they spent there, sitting on the porch in the warm late April air with Patrick, who was 4 years old and an irrepressible, dark-haired force of nature, who combined his mother's directness with his father's physical grace to an effect that was both delightful and exhausting. Samuel put his arm around Theodora and they sat in the quiet of the high ground and looked out at the valley and the mountains and the last light going gold above the western horizon. "Your father would have loved this," Samuel said. "He did love it," she said. "He just never got to build on it. You built on it for him." She leaned into his shoulder. "We built on it," she said. In 1885, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Margaret Clara, the second name for Clara Dix, who had been, by that point, a fixture in their lives for 7 years, and who received the news of the honor with the composed practicality of a woman who is moved but not inclined to show it in public, and then cried quietly in her storeroom for 20 minutes, which Pete the barkeep reported with great fondness for years afterward. Margaret was born in November, the same month as her parents' wedding, and from the beginning she had her mother's gray eyes and her father's almost smile, and she was a different creature entirely from Patrick, quieter and more watchful and capable of a focused attention that made adults slightly uncomfortable when she turned it on them. Patrick adored her. This was apparent from the first week, when he stationed himself as near her cradle as he was permitted and reported any changes in her status to whichever parent was in range with the seriousness of someone at an important post. Life on the ridge had its rhythms and its difficulties, as all lives do. There were drought years and years of good rain. There were arguments between Theodora and Samuel that were, on the whole, productive arguments, the kind between people who have strong views and trust each other enough to push back hard and mean it, and who have also learned that the distance between a disagreement and a reconciliation is shorter when you stop trying to win and start trying to understand. There were nights when the old things surfaced for Samuel, the weight of Chester Farrow, and the years of carrying the service's ambivalent verdict, and Theodora would sit with him in the dark and not say anything particularly useful, because she had learned that what he needed in those moments was not resolution but company, and she was good at being present in a way that required nothing from him. There were mornings when she missed her father with an ache that was still clean and sharp, missed his intelligence and his particular humor, and the way he had seen the potential of this land before he had any practical reason to. And Samuel would sit with her in the same quiet way, present and patient. And eventually, the morning would brighten, and the valley would be doing something extraordinary with the light, and they would drink their coffee on the porch, and she would feel her father in the landscape the way she had always believed she would. Clara Dix sold the Rattlesnake Saloon in 1886 and came to live in a house she built on the east edge of the Ridge property, close enough to be present and far enough for genuine independence, which was exactly what all parties wanted. She helped Theodora with the children and with the accounts of the silver operation when the numbers needed more hands, and she and Samuel had developed, over the years, the specific warm friendship of two people who both love the same person in very different ways and have made peace with the fact that their love is therefore complementary rather than competitive. In 1887, when Patrick was 8 and Margaret was 2, Theodora told Samuel she was expecting again, and this time there was no astonishment in his face, only a warmth so deep and immediate that she felt it physically from across the room. "Another Yates to build things," he said, "or to build completely different things," she said. "I refuse to predetermine what they'll find interesting." "That is profoundly optimistic of you." "I've always been optimistic," she said. "You knew that." He crossed to her and kissed her, slow and deliberate and warm, the kiss of a man who has been kissing the same woman for 9 years and has still not run out of intention for it. "Yes," he said against her hair. "I knew that." Their third child, a son they named Thomas, arrived in April of 1888, on a morning of extraordinary clear light that flooded the Ridge house and turned the red earth outside the windows to copper. Thomas came into the world loudly, which Patrick found very interesting and Margaret found somewhat alarming, and which Dr. Forsyth, who had delivered all 3 Yates children, described as entirely normal and healthy. Thomas grew to be a large baby and then a large child, broad in the shoulders like his great-grandfather on Theodora's mother's side, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes and a disposition that was sunny and stubborn in equal measure. He did not walk, he charged. He did not speak, he announced. He attached himself to the horses of the livery from the age of 3, with a passion that delighted his father, and gave his mother a controlled anxiety she managed with the same pragmatism she brought to everything. Patrick, by the time he was 10, was showing an aptitude for the mathematics of engineering that made Theodora's father's spirit feel very present whenever she watched her son work through a problem with his pencil and his serious brow. She wrote to the school in Santa Fe, and then to the one in Albuquerque, about what education might be available for a boy who was clearly going to need more advanced instruction than Cutter's Creek School. Even the fine new school her money had helped build could provide. Margaret, at 4 and then 5 and then 6, read with an intensity that recalled her mother precisely, and had a habit of correcting adults on points of factual accuracy that was deeply funny to her parents and slightly less funny to the adults being corrected. Samuel taught her chess when she was 6, and she beat him by the time she was 8, which he told everyone about with no embarrassment whatsoever. Cutter's Creek had become, by the end of the 1880s, a real town in the way that the word real implies some permanence and self-determination. The new sheriff maintained order without corruption. The school educated children without distinction of background. The mine on the ridge employed 30 men at fair wages, a point of pride that Theodora held to with the tenacity of someone who had watched what the unfair version looked like from very close range. Victor Crane was released from federal prison in 1891, having served 12 years minus time accounting for his age and certain health considerations. He did not return to the New Mexico territory. He went east to relatives in Ohio and was not heard from again in any way that touched Cutter's Creek. Theodora received the news from Judge Whitfield's successor with the equanimity of a woman who has spent years building something so solid that the original threat to it has become historical rather than present. Samuel received the same news with a careful stillness and then said, very simply, "Good," and went back to what he was doing. The 1890s came, and with them a change in the character of the territory itself. The frontier was closing, in the sense that the newspapers and the politicians used that word, though what they meant by it was complex, and what it actually meant to the people living in those places was more complex still. The Apache people who had shaped this landscape for centuries had suffered enormously through the territorial period, the injustices of which were real and ongoing, and which Theodora did not look away from, choosing instead to use the influence her property and prosperity gave her to speak where she could, to support the claims of Apache families who had been dispossessed of their own high country land, to insist in the territorial legislature's proceedings that the accounting of history include what had actually happened rather than only what was convenient. Samuel supported this entirely. It was not a popular position in some quarters, and they navigated the opposition together with the same directness they brought to everything else, without apology and without belligerence, which was sometimes harder than either but generally more effective. Patrick left for the engineering school in Albuquerque in 1896, at 17, having distinguished himself at the Cutter's Creek School to the point where his teachers had run out of things to give him. He left on a September morning with his grandfather's transit packed carefully in his bag, and his mother's voice in his ear telling him to write weekly, which he did, religiously, letters that were dense with technical description and occasional observations about the city that made both his parents laugh. Margaret, at 11, stood on the porch and watched her brother ride away, and then went inside and picked up a book, which was her established method for processing large emotions. Thomas, at 8, declared that he was going to be a horse breeder, and that he already knew everything he needed to know, which declaration his father received with such magnificent composure that Theodora had to go into the kitchen for a moment to collect herself. On the evening of the 20th anniversary of their marriage, in November of 1898, Samuel and Theodora sat on the porch of the Ridge house as they had sat on so many evenings in 20 years, and the valley below them was going dark in layers. The deep blue of the shadows in the canyon first, then the silver and gray of the sage plain, then the last gold line at the western mountain edge before that too went purple and dark. Patrick was 20 now and finishing his second year of engineering school. Margaret was 13 and had announced that she intended to study law, which Theodora had greeted with pure delight, and Samuel with the slightly dazed expression of a man recalibrating his sense of what the world was going to look like in 20 years. Thomas was 10 and could already handle any horse in the livery stable and several that were not in it, and was in every other way exactly himself, loud and warm and completely convinced of his own particular rightness. Clara Dix, who was 63 and entirely undimmed, had come for supper and then gone back to her own house with the clear and stated intention of not interrupting whatever the occasion called for, which Theodora had found both tactful and very Clara. They sat in the quiet, and the dark came down over the valley and the stars came out, the same stars that had blazed above them on the streets of Cutter's Creek in the first autumn, when the world was still a crisis and they had not yet said out loud the things they were both already certain of. 20 years, Samuel said. 20 years, Theodora agreed. Are you satisfied? He asked. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. He still asked genuine questions. She thought about it properly, the way she had always thought about the things he asked her. She thought about the land and the school and the mine and her father's instruments and the 3 children who were, each in their own way, more themselves than she had known to hope for. She thought about the evenings and the arguments and the reconciliations and the particular quality of being known, truly known, by another person in a way that does not require explanation or performance. Yes, she said, completely. She turned to look at him. His face was 49 years old, and she knew every line of it, the weathered jaw and the green eyes and the precise way he held his stillness. Are you? He was quiet for a moment in the way she had loved from the first week, the quiet of genuine consideration rather than hesitation. I am, he said. I am satisfied and grateful and still, after 20 years, the luckiest man in the New Mexico territory. She laughed. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and the valley was dark now, and the stars were extraordinary, and somewhere below the ridge, the town of Cutter's Creek had its lights burning like a constellation brought to ground. The saloon and the school and the doctor's office and the church and the new buildings that had grown up in the 20 years since she had ridden in on a freight wagon with her father's instruments and her letter and her life waiting to be built. I love you, she said. Simply as she always said it. I love you, he said, without qualification as he always said it. The desert night was cool and full of stars, and the land below them was theirs, not only in the legal sense of the word, but in the deeper sense of a place that carries you because you have carried it, where every view is a record of what you have built, and every silence holds the voice of everything that mattered. They sat there together on the porch of the house on Redstone Ridge, 2 people who had found each other in a crisis, and had spent 20 years discovering that the best version of love is not the rescue but the building, the daily accumulated choosing of each other across all the ordinary weathers of a life. In the spring of 1899, when the desert bloomed briefly and brilliantly in the way it does in a good rain year, when the prickly pear put out its improbable scarlet flowers, and the cottonwoods along the creek threw their pale green light up at the sky, Theodora Callahan Yates stood on the high ground of Redstone Ridge with her husband beside her, and her daughter reading on the porch behind her, and her youngest son somewhere below in the livery where he was happiest. And she looked out at the valley that her father had loved before she knew to love it, and she felt the specific peace of a woman who has fought for what she was owed, and built what she intended and loved without apology or reservation, and she thought that this was exactly what a life was supposed to feel like. Not easy, not without cost, but real and hers and worth every hard day that had led to it. The land waited, patient as it had always been, warm in the morning sun, red and ancient and entirely itself, holding the history of everything that had happened on it and everything that would, all the ordinary, extraordinary dailiness of a life chosen, and built and lived well on the high ground above the valley, in the desert country of the New Mexico Territory, in the last years of the 19th century, by a woman who had arrived on a freight wagon with her father's instruments and a letter, and a man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly her.